Okay, so we pretty much beat intervals to death. But believe it or not, there is more we can learn about intervals, like different types of consonances and how intervals resolve. But I want to move on to more advanced topics before I completely lose you. Now in Melody Part 1, we already talked about building triads on the major scale, but I want to dig in just a little bit deeper. Now, as we said before, triads are built using thirds going up a major scale or a minor scale. So in C major, we have the following triads: C major, D minor, E minor, F major, G major, A minor, B diminished, and C major. And we also talked about the different qualities of the triads: major, minor, and diminished. But let's look at what makes a major triad major and a minor triad minor, and so on. Now, if you think about it, for every triad, there are 3 different intervals. There's the intervals between the bottom note and the second note, and then between the second note and the third note. And then there's also the interval between the bottom note and the top note. Now, all 3 of these intervals is what determines the quality of a chord. In each chord, we also have the names for the notes that are separate from their scale degrees. They're the root, the third, and the fifth. So let's look at each chord in detail. Major chords has as their first interval a major third, and that means from the root to the third, the interval is a major. Then the next interval, from the third to the fifth, is a minor third. What this does is it also means that there's a perfect fifth between the root and the fifth. So 2 thirds, a major and a minor, or minor and major, equals a perfect fifth. And it's these qualities that create a major chord. So if C is our root, and we have E as the third, a major third above C, and then G, a minor third above that, it's also a perfect fifth above C. Now minor chords have a minor third between the root and the third, and then a major third between the third and the fifth. And this also leaves a perfect fifth between the root and the fifth. So let's look at a different chord. If we have D as the root, and we have F as the third, it's a minor third, and the fifth is A, it's a major third above F. That also leaves us with a perfect fifth above D, and a minor chord. Diminished chords have a minor third between the root and the third, and then another minor third between the third and the fifth. Now this means that unlike the other chords, it does not have a perfect fifth above the root. It has a diminished fifth, which is where the chord gets its name, a diminished chord. And then augmented chords have a major third above the root, and then another major third above the third, which makes that last interval not a perfect fifth, but an augmented fifth, which is where it gets its name. Now, because the major and minor chords have only consonant intervals, the major and minor intervals, they're considered consonant chords. Diminished and augmented are considered dissonant chords, meaning they specifically want to resolve to another chord. Now we'll talk more about consonant and dissonant intervals when we get to the next lesson on seventh chords. Now in Melody Part 1, we also talked about Roman numerals and how they designate which scale degree the chord is built on. And for each scale, major and minor, the triads have different qualities, which is what gives each scale its characteristic sounds when composing with it. So the major scale has 3 major triads. You got 1, 4, and 5. There's also 3 minor triads. You got 2, you've got 3, you've got 6. And then there's 1 diminished triad, the 7. And then 7, of course, has that little degree symbol right at the top right of it. And that shows that it's diminished. Now let me say something for a minute about Roman numerals. In music theory, there are 2 main ways of writing Roman numerals, which include all capitals, or capitals for major and lowercase for minor. I personally like to use capitals for major and lowercase for minor, but depending on which textbook you're using or what school you go to, you may see something different. I recommend just picking one and sticking to it. And for me, using the system that makes the most sense when just glancing at the page quickly is the way to go. And in that case, you look at a lowercase 2 and you know instantly that it's a minor chord. So in natural minor, it's just the opposite of major. You have 3 minor triads, so 1, 4, and 5. And then you have 3 major triads, 3, 6, and 7. And then you have 1 diminished, which is a second chord. In most music, though, as far as harmony goes, you will hear the harmonic minor scale used instead of the natural minor. Remember, in harmonic minor, we raise the 7th scale degree. Now, I'll talk about this more in later lessons when we start composing in minor keys, but I do want you to be familiar with the sound. So, in harmonic minor, we have 2 minor chords, 1 and 4. We have 2 major chords, which is 5 and 6. We have 2 diminished chords, which is 2 and 7. And then we also have an augmented chord, which is the 3. Now, in reality, you won't really hear the augmented 3 chord used that much, at least not in traditional classical music. You will hear it more in the Romantic and early 20th century, but we're not really quite there yet. So I want you to go ahead and change that augmented 3 to a major 3, which means that we now have 2 minor and 3 major chords, 3, 5, and 6, and then 2 diminished chords. So far, the whole Roman numeral thing should seem pretty easy. I mean, you have a note in a scale, and then you build a triad over it, and depending on where that note starts in the scale, then you should be able to find the Roman numeral. But this becomes a little more important as we start to add inversions. So let's look at a few different chords. One is C in root position, one C in first inversion, and then one C in second inversion. If you look at all the notes, they are the same in each chord, C, E, and G, but hopefully you notice that each chord has a different bottom note or different bass note. The first one is called root position, and this means that the root of the chord is in the bass. It's what we are familiar with already. It's basically what we've been working with, and it sounds like this. The next one is called the first inversion. The first inversion means that you are placing the third of the chord in the bass, and it sounds like this. And then the last one is called the second inversion, and the second inversion means that the fifth is in the bass, and it sounds like this. Listen one more time to the difference between the 3 triads. I'll try to play it a little bit lower here. So you got root position, then you got first inversion, then second inversion. And just as with everything else, we have a way of designating which inversion a chord is in. And we use a system called figured bass. Now, figured bass was originally a system used by harpsichord players and other musicians to fill in missing notes from a bass line. They looked at a note and then the numbers, and they knew what notes to play above the bass. And over the years, it was changed and evolved into a useful way for theorists to designate chord inversions. So now we use figured bass along with Roman numerals to say which note is the root, which is the Roman numeral, what the chord quality is, upper or lower case, and then inversions of the chord, which is the figured bass, the little numbers. So why is this important to you as a composer? Well, it allows you to understand exactly what is happening in a piece of music, whether it's your own or someone else's. understanding the chord and its inversion will tell you a lot about how the melody is interacting with the harmony, and maybe even more importantly, how it interacts with the bass line. Now remember back to the section on the history of music when I talked about how composers used a system of composing called counterpoint. But this was superseded by a system of harmony codified by Jean-Philippe Rameau. Well, in reality, the old system of counterpoint didn't really go away. It's still there, and we're still using it today. We just look at it from a new perspective. Originally, counterpoint was not concerned with harmony. Now, this seems strange as traditional counterpoint is clearly very harmonious. So when I say they weren't concerned with harmony, what I mean is they were not concerned about which chord led to which chord. They didn't care that much if I led to 5, or if 1 led to 5, or 5 to 1. What they were concerned with was the melodies of each line and how they flowed. Were they singable? And were the intervals between the melodies consonant or dissonant? But over time, composers started to see trends within the music they and others were writing. Certain melodic intervals seemed to want to lead to other melodic intervals. In particular, the intervals between the bottom notes or the bass line and the top notes or the soprano line. After Jean-Philippe Rameau wrote his treatise on harmony, composers didn't magically just stop thinking about the melodies of each line, but they did start looking at them differently. What they found was that they could use the techniques of counterpoint, like which intervals between two melodies sound consonant and dissonant, or which intervals are difficult to sing in a single melody, and then apply them to the concepts of harmonic movement. What this led to was a way of looking at the movement of chords so that it stayed smooth and melodic, but still had a functional harmonic sound. Let me illustrate with a chord progression. If we were to take a look at this chord progression, I think we can all agree it's pretty boring. It's just 1 to 5 to 1 to 5 to 1. But if we were to pay a little more attention to the bass line and use chord inversions, then we can have a much more interesting bass line. Something like this. So there are several things going on here. First, we have the two most important chords, the tonic and the dominant chords, that are moving back and forth. This harmonic movement is extremely important. I recommend, especially as a beginner composer, spending a lot of time becoming comfortable composing with those two chords. Second, we're using inversions of the two triads to create an interesting bass line. Instead of just C to G to C to G to C, we have the bass line C, D, E, B, C. Now finally, we are also looking at the voice leading of each line. Now this lesson is just an introduction to voice leading. We'll become more familiar with it later on as we get into 4-part writing. But when I say voice leading, really what I'm talking about is a concern for the movement of each single melodic line. And that's what each part of the chord is. It's a single melody. Now just as in earlier times with counterpoint, we too are worried about how the melodies fit together. We're trying to make them smooth, interesting, and singable. So let's look at each line here. First, the melody starts on an E and then moves to a D. This is an easy interval to sing. After that, it jumps up to a G. Now this interval is a perfect fourth and is still relatively easy to sing. In particular, the soprano, being on top of all the other parts, tends to have an easier time singing larger intervals than the inner voices do. After that, the soprano stays on G and then jumps down to the E. Mixing up conjunct motion, which is moving by steps, disjunct motion, which is moving by leaps, and staying on the same notes, is one of the keys to good melody writing. Now let's look at the bass line. The bass line, unlike the original C, G, C, G, C, now moves by conjunct motion or stepwise motion from C to E. We're still using the same chords, which you can tell by the Roman numerals below, but the bass is much more interesting. The D is a 5 chord in second inversion, and the E is a 1 chord in first inversion. So from there, the bass leaps down to a B, which is the 5 chord in first inversion. And just as with the soprano line, mixing up leaps and steps makes an interesting melody. And just because the bass is at the bottom doesn't mean it's not a melody. Finally, it moves by step back to C, which is the 1 chord in first inversion. That does it for triads. Be sure to do the triad exercises for this lesson before moving on to the next.